Good evening, everyone. We're going to get started right on time because we have 6 speakers and 60 minutes. So this is a challenge for all of us here to stick to time. And it's a bit of an adventure because we usually have these webinars for 90 minutes, but we're experimenting with 60 today. So good morning, good afternoon, good evening from wherever you're joining. My name is Neha Sharma. I work at the Adaptation Fund. I lead the results, impact, and knowledge team here. I'm really excited about this topic because it's a topic I personally feel very passionate about. And we have a lineup of really great speakers and some rich content to share with you. So this webinar is going to be about scaling climate adaptation. What we're going to do is look at what scaling means for the Adaptation Fund and discover and discuss pathways that are leading to scaling at the Adaptation Fund or can help us in the future achieve more scaling through adaptation finance. What you have in front of you here is the agenda for today. We're going to start with opening remarks from Mikko Olekainen, who's the head of the Adaptation Fund. Thank you, Mikko, for joining us. We know you're quite busy at the moment at another climate conference, but thank you so much for making the time to join us and do the opening for this. We're then going to be hearing from Dr. Karen Kemper, who's the Senior Advisor and Co-Chair for Climate Change Working Group on Community of Practice on Scaling. She has recently done a case study looking at the Adaptation Fund and scaling, and she's going to share with us what she's found through that case study. We're then going to hear briefly from Susan Legro, who is the Adaptation Fund Technical Evaluation Reference Group, the TURG member, and she will be sharing findings from an evaluation that was completed last year by the AF-TURG on scalability and was much of the motivation for the case study that followed by Dr. Karen Kemper. So we'll hear from Susan as well. We're then going to hear from our country partners who are going to share what scaling looked like in the projects in country and what factors helped achieve that scaling. So we're going to hear from Natasha Olifinskaya, who's the Regional Technical Specialist for Adaptation at UNDP. And we're going to hear from Diane Dusabe, who is the Program Manager at the Ministry of Environment in Rwanda. We're finally going to wrap up with hearing from Martina Dorigo, who is the Portfolio Management Coordinator at the Adaptation Fund. I did the introductions up front so we can save some time a little bit later. But just the invitation also has the names of the people who will be speaking and their bios will be shared later. I'll say up front that we will be sharing a recording of this session. It is being recorded, and we will be sharing the case study and the relevant links with everybody who's attending. I know that's a question that comes up often, so I thought I'll address that up front as well. So with that, Mikko, again, thank you so much for making time to join us. I'm going to hand over to you to share a little bit about how the Adaptation Fund is approaching scaling of its projects, but also scaling of its impact. So Mikko, over to you.
Thank you, Neha. Good morning, good afternoon, colleagues. It's my great pleasure to welcome you to this webinar on scaling climate adaptation lessons and insights from practice. I'd like to extend my warm thanks to all of you for joining us today, colleagues from the Adaptation Fund Secretariat, our implementing and executing entities, as well as practitioners, funders, and partners from across climate finance and adaptation community. The theme of today's discussion could not be more timely or more important. Across the world, we have seen compelling examples of successful adaptation interventions restoring coastal ecosystems that buffer communities against storms, diversifying crops to...
This is your red line train.
Mikko, go ahead.
Okay, thank you. Diversifying crops to withstand droughts and floods, and establishing early warning systems that save countless of lives. So these are powerful demonstrations of what works. Yet the challenge before us is profound. How do we move from isolated, often small successes to impacts at scale, reaching the millions and hundreds of millions of people, ecosystems and economies that urgently need to adapt to climate change? For the Adaptation Fund, scaling is not an afterthought. It's actually part of our DNA. Since the inception of the fund, we've been supporting innovative, concrete, locally led adaptation actions that deliver tangible benefits while also generating learning evidence and models that can be replicated, expanded, and embedded into broader systems. Our current second medium-term strategy explicitly elevates scale as a defining aspect of the fund's mandate. And I'd like to share a few ways in which the Adaptation Fund is approaching scaling. Firstly, through innovation. Our innovation facility, which is one of the three pillars of the fund, allows us to pilot promising and sometimes riskier solutions. By de-risking and testing new approaches, we help to create the conditions for these solutions to be taken up and expanded by others, including other climate funds, development banks, and governments. Secondly, through direct access. By empowering national institutions to access resources directly, we strengthen local ownership and institutional capacity. This not only builds resilience on the ground, but also enables these institutions to leverage our grants to unlock larger pools of finance, and we've seen that in many cases. Thirdly, through financial provisions that are tailored for our direct access entities. By providing scale-up grants, for instance, to develop a project scale-up pathway, and in addition to by offering to all of our implementing entities flexible grant-based financing for adaptation, which includes the option of full cost financing, we lower barriers for institutions to innovate and catalyze further funding for larger envelopes. And fourthly, through knowledge and learning. Our projects generate lessons that we capture and share widely. The knowledge function of the fund positions it as a broker of practical adaptation solutions, which can help others to replicate successes and avoid common pitfalls and build on proven approaches. And we are evolving. In recent years, the Adaptation Fund has deliberately strengthened its contribution to scaling. We've been working on a scale-up framework with the Green Climate Fund, providing a structured pathway for successful Adaptation Fund projects to secure larger envelopes of the GCF finance, and GCF projects typically being larger. We refined our results framework to better capture outcomes related to replication, sustainability, and systemic change. And we continue to build our role as a knowledge hub, not just as a financier, but as a global platform for learning and exchange on scalable adaptation. Colleagues, these efforts are increasingly critical in the current global context. The new collective quantified goal, NCQG, that was agreed on at COP29 last November, calls for a significant increase in climate finance, including a tripling of finance for adaptation. This new ambition underscores the urgent need not only to mobilize more resources, but also to ensure that those resources can deliver impact at scale. For us at the Adaptation Fund, scaling is the bridge between increased finance and real impact. Scaling is how we can ensure that additional finance translate into broader resilience, which then supports systemic change rather than fragmented projects. At the same time, as much as we are talking about the importance of scaling here, it's important also to note that we are not only talking about scaling existing projects to larger investments. We do need also totally new initiatives in countries, new ideas, and in many countries there are still sectors that have not been served by adaptation projects, and it's valuable that those deserve attention too. But in the big picture, looking at the scale of the challenge, there's a lot that we can achieve through scaling. That's why today's webinar matters. Drawing on findings from a recent case study and evaluation, we'll explore what scalability really means in the context of Adaptation Fund and how it can be deliberately designed and supported, and how we can track and learn from those processes. And we are lucky to have the lead author of the new study, Dr. Karin Kemper, with us today to present this exciting study. and I look forward to today's discussions and the insights that they will generate. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Mikko, for highlighting the importance of scaling, but also features of the Adaptation Fund that are helping us achieve this, including our innovation funding window, the scale-up grants, the lessons learned that we're sharing broadly, and scale-up frameworks that we're developing with other funds, including other measures that you mentioned. And your opening remarks are, of course, a great segue into the presentation that Dr. Karen Kemper will make. So Dr. Karen, I'll invite you to share your screen. Yes, I see something happening and we see some slides already, so thank you so much. Over to you.
Yes, thank you, Neha, and thank you, Nico. It's really a great pleasure to be here today at this webinar on scaling climate adaptation and to present to you the study that I've undertaken over the past months on how mainstreaming has been working at the Adaptation Fund with regard to scaling. I'm the co-chair of the Climate Change Working Group of the Scaling Community of Practice. The Scaling Community of Practice was founded some 11 years ago to strengthen the development and climate communities' ability to design and deliver sustainable solutions that match the scale of the need. And of course, we just heard from Mikko again how big the need is on the climate side. The SCOP has 5,000 members in 127 countries, about half of which are from the global south, and in total it's from about 1,300 institutions, to give you an idea of who is behind that. Now, in the next slide, we see the purpose of the study. Please, next slide, where the SCOP has in the last 2 years has undertaken a mainstreaming initiative of development funders in order to assess how scaling is embedded in selected funders' strategies and operations. And we chose to work with the Adaptation Fund, firstly, because they wanted, but second, also because it has such a strong commitment to scaling. And so the idea of the study is to provide learnings from the fund's scaling journey to development funders, and also to provide some insights of what could be next steps in terms of scaling to for the Adaptation Fund itself. Next slide. Here you see a few studies that have been undertaken. Please, next slide. Of the various institution, you see IFAD, you see AfD, you see GIZ, there's also IDB and so on. So if you're interested, it is on the website. So this is the body of studies of some 25 studies. This is just a selection. Now, how does this link to the Adaptation Fund? Next slide, please. Mikko already talked about what the Adaptation Fund is doing, and I just like to highlight 2 particular things. One is that it is now serving the Paris Agreement, from having moved from the Kyoto Agreement, now also serving the Paris Agreement. That is important. And the second, it was really a pioneer for direct access by national implementing entities in developing countries to get financing from the fund. And there's a majority of developing countries on the board. And I remember very well when the Adaptation Fund was created and became operational in 2009, what a big deal that was for developing countries. So it's very special, in addition to all the other things that it's doing. On the next slide, you see why scaling matters right now. There's the global adaptation needs are rising sharply. We heard about the COP29 mandate to triple adaptation finance, but for the Adaptation Fund, importantly, it's at an inflection point because it's a very well known niche innovator. And the question is, how can it move to also being a transformational funder? Next slide, please. So let me go into what is scaling for this particular study. Those of you who have worked with scaling for a while, you know that there are very many different definitions. And for this one, I have chosen an amalgamation. And so I'm looking at it as we do in the scope on a continuum. On the one hand, you have transactional scaling, where you make bigger projects and more projects achieving the reach to more beneficiaries, more countries, more geographical areas. But then on the other end of the continuum, you have the transformational scaling, where you support systems change in various means to such an extent that actually you get a long-term scale. And the important thing here is that you do it within a potential pathway to contribute to the bigger goal. So it's not just the one-off, but you see how would it, for instance, in adaptation, how does it really help a country, a region, or the world to move towards adaptation? And the Adaptation Fund, like many other organizations, combines these two parts. So the continuum is a combination. It's not one or the other. And we will hear more about it in the next slides. What was the methodology used for the study? Well, document review, interviews with a whole range of people, and then we applied the framework by the SCOP, which is about 8 scaling principles that you see on the next slide, and they were found by the work of the SCOP to be principles for successful mainstreaming in development funder organizations. And these principles, they go from a vision of scale and what to scale to creating an evidence base that you can learn from and then continue to adapt. And we'll talk about that in the coming slides. So now let's move to the next slide, where we look at what is the vision of scale of the Adaptation Fund. Now, the fund became operational in 2009. It was created at the time to draw funding from the carbon markets. The idea was to take a percentage of each carbon transaction, and the idea was that it would actually go to scale from the beginning from these transactions. What no one really foresaw was a carbon market collapse. That funding didn't at the time work out so well. And so it turned to being donors who financed the adaptation funds primarily, not entirely, for these years. But where does the fund stand now? Well, it has embedded scaling in its strategy up to 2027. There have been recent board decisions that show an increasing scaling mindset. And there's, of course, Article 6 in the climate negotiations that will hopefully, over the medium term, actually increase this independent funding source that has eluded the fund a little bit over the past 14 years. So this would then be the moment to actually articulate a bold vision for 2030 or 35 with clear impact targets for scaling that the fund could do in order to see where it wants to go with its scaling scaling strategy and its steps towards scaling. So on the next slide, you see principle 2. So what to scale in the case of the Adaptation Fund. There's a lot of increase in transactional scaling that is going on. That's important because it has been a relatively small fund. You can see that in the study. I'm not going to go into the increases, but there have been important decisions on how to increase it. There's clear elements of transformational scaling on this continuum that I was talking about, from innovation, locally led adaptation. There are scaling grants and learning grants that countries can access. And because it is serving the Paris agreements, also when countries apply for funding, they do the national implementing entities, they operate within their broader country goals, including their national adaptation plans, for instance. So there is the ambition that it fits into this bigger pathway towards climate adaptation at national and regional levels. And importantly, and Nico talked about that, cooperation with larger funders that can pick up on the scaling. So looking forward, one would think that there would be a balance of both these sides scaling up, both the transactional and also continued work on the transformational scaling. So principle 3, very quickly on the next slide. Who scales? A very important question when you want to look at funders, and because someone will have to do it. And in the study you will see a detailed explanation of how the board is responsible. The countries, of course, are the ultimate scalers because it's a demand-driven fund. We have other funders in terms of the vertical climate funds, MDBs, and so on. And absolutely the secretariat. So a number of actors who need to work together with their different mandates in order to drive scaling forward, as it has been happening now in the past months and actually recent years. The next slide, the principle is you have to plan for scaling. It doesn't really happen by itself. You need to have an operational definition. I'm pretty sure Susan from the Turk will talk about that. It's something that still remains to be done for the Adaptation Fund. We have to have concrete scaling targets and so on. So let's, in the interest of time, move on to the next slide. Implementing scaling. So there has been a lot of progress. You see that on the left-hand side of the slide on that things I just talked about, increased project size caps and country access caps, and etc. What is still to do? Well, a comprehensive scaling plan. I do believe the Secretariat is working on that. And I want to highlight one particular point here: systematic project handover. A number of organizations, they think, well, we have a good project, we have evaluated it, it's excellent, surely someone will scale it up, maybe the country itself with its own funds, or there will be another funder funding it. And many times that doesn't really happen. So one principle of having successful scaling in a funder organization is to think about how are we going to do that? How at end of project will we have a systematic handover in order to go to scale if we are not financing the next scale, the next step? That's an important one. On the next slide, the evidence base. There's already work in the fund going on very successfully on creating an evidence base. And we go to the, not to the next slide, but to the other slide as I'm coming to an end of this presentation. Some considerations for next steps would then be, what follows from this are to define a scaling vision and targets for 2030-35, expand the financial capacity for the transactional scaling, strengthen partnerships and incentives that could even be co- and parallel financing, the frameworks that Miko talked about, systematically integrate scaling metrics into project frameworks, and continue the support to institutions with their readiness to access larger projects, both from the adaptation funds and others. And then finally, some closing thoughts on the next slide. The outcome of the study, or the result, is the Adaptation Fund is well positioned to strengthen both the transactional and transformational scaling. It has shown over its 14 years of life, 16 years, that it has this trajectory of adapting to changing circumstances and challenges. And with a deliberate strategy and a vision, it can be a really important contributor to helping close the adaptation finance gap and deliver the systematic and impact that is needed in order to create lasting and scaled development outcomes. So I thank you for listening to that. And with that, I turn back to Neha.
Thank you, Karen, and thank you for laying out these principles, which have been very helpful at the Adaptation Fund to, as Karen was saying, plan for scale, because scaling doesn't just happen, you have to plan for it. So these principles, I think, to any organization provide a very helpful guide in thinking through that process. And also the spectrum of transactional and transformational scaling, without saying it's either or, but that it is a spectrum and that you need both. So thank you. I think those messages came out quite clearly from your presentation. If you do have questions for Dr. Kemper, please feel free to use the chat function. I will be picking up questions in the last 10 minutes of this webinar to see if we have a few minutes for them to answer. And with that, we're going to hand to Susan Legro. Thank you, Susan, for being here. Thank you for doing this really excellent evaluation, which you know that the fund has been using quite a bit since it was published. So Susan, over to you to share some findings from this evaluation. And if you wanted to respond to anything Dr. Kemper said, you're welcome to do that as well. Thanks, Susan.
Great, thank you. Let's see, just get to my slides. Here we go. Thanks very much. And no, I just wanted to thank Dr. Kemper, because that really is the ideal introduction, I think, because she presented a real overview of scaling at the fund and scaling on climate finance. And I am here because I was the focal point on an evaluation that looks primarily at the portfolio, so the projects at the heart of the Adaptation Fund scaling work. So I'll tell you about that very briefly. As Neha said, this was work that was presented to the board last year.
So basically, see the slides. Sorry to interrupt.
Oh, you don't. Let me make sure. I'm sorry. See if I can share again.
We saw them for a second, but then they.
Oh dear. Okay, let's try this. Is that better?
Yes, we see them now. Thank you.
Perfect. Okay, thanks. So essentially, we had two questions. We wanted to know, is scaling incorporated into the design of the projects at the Adaptation Fund? And if so, how? And then we also wanted to know whether the fund was contributing to scaling adaptation through its projects. So those were our two burning questions. And those questions really led to the design of, let me get there we go, our evaluation, which was a 4-phase evaluation. You can see the picture of the evaluation report on the right. I'll provide a link to that evaluation at the end of this talk, and I would encourage people to take a look. We started with a scoping exercise and a landscape review to really set the stage. But then the heart of, I would say, the evaluation was this portfolio assessment, where we took a random sample of 21 projects in the portfolio and analyzed the 3 stages in the project activities. We looked at documentation, and then we held consultations. And to give credit where credit is due, the lead evaluator on this study was Martin Rokitsky of PlanAdapt, and the portfolio analysis we'll be seeing now was conducted by Mariana Vidal, who is one of our evaluators. So as you can see, when we talked about the 3 stages of scaling, we were looking at where are the projects with adaptive technologies? Were they doing early piloting? Were they looking at a specific intervention that had not really been tested before? Were they doing piloting for scaling or demonstrations? I think, as you know, most of us know them. Or were they doing scaling up, replication, or expanding the impact? So what we found from the sample was that most of the projects that were sampled were looking at piloting or piloting for scaling. And then a few projects were looking at scaling. One project was doing both. And I think that kind of conforms to what Nico described in the project as a willingness to innovate and try new things. We also found that there were different types of activities that were favored depending on whether the projects were looking more at piloting activities or scaling activities. For example, the projects you can see in light green that we're piloting were really emphasizing knowledge and information dissemination, capacity development, participatory processes. And then you can see with the scaling projects, there was a little more emphasis on sustainable financing and some attention to policy framework. Although I have to say here, we have a small sample. I'd really like to go back and do this analysis again now that we have more projects in the portfolio. One other thing that we looked at in the evaluation that I think might be interesting to the audience is the sequencing of scaling. How did the Adaptation Fund come in? Were they doing the piloting and then passing on projects to be scaled up by other funders? So we had a real variety here. In some cases, piloting was supported by other projects, and then the Adaptation Fund project would scale up the results. In other cases, the Adaptation Fund was supporting piloting, and then the project would be scaled up by another source of funding. And I think, for example, the most common example is the Green Climate Fund. But you can also see that in Mode E, the piloting was supported by the Adaptation Fund project, but the document didn't indicate how the scaling would take place. And I should note here that it is not mandatory for projects to build scaling into their project design. So it's not a shortcoming based on current requirements. Just to give you a sense of, the type of sequencing, what projects are these? For example, this is one of the projects that was piloted by another project, and then you had scaling through the Adaptation Fund project. It's a project in Sierra Leone looking at climate resilience in the cocoa and rice sectors. And that's an EFAD project that is still under implementation, and it was designed to scale up and replicate many of the activities that had been piloted by a GEF project. And I think this was quite interesting because some good practice, there was a joint project formulation mission that had been conducted by EFAD and the GEF when they were getting ready to propose this larger project. Another example, also quite interesting, is a project where the piloting and the scaling was done through subsequent Adaptation Fund projects. So you had an Adaptation Fund project that piloted a lot of technologies such as early warning systems and agroforestry greenhouses. You can see this is in the southern region of Egypt. And then you had a second Adaptation Fund project that replicated this in 15 additional communities. And I think an additional interesting element with this project is how it piloted additional adaptation technologies in the second project, which we hope will be scaled up, I think, in a subsequent project. So from the findings that we had in our evaluation, just a few selected findings, we found, and I think, this is very consistent with what Dr. Kemper found, there are, several elements of scalability and replication in the fund strategies and policies. There's not currently a unified definition of scaling scalability, but that there are many elements in the medium-term strategy to support this desired outcome of enabling scaling and replication. And we noted that the GCF partnership to scale up Adaptation Fund projects through the GCF was a really noteworthy approach. And then we also found for projects in scaling pathways, sampled projects did not usually specify whether or how they would scale. I think this is wholly consistent with sort of general evidence we find on interventions. More broadly, it's consistent with what the OECD DAC has found. And then we also found that multilateral funds have been used to scale up projects, and sampled projects did not really include non-grant sources of financing. So we think there are ways they can look more broadly for scaling. And then finally, in terms of supporting scaling in projects, we encourage the proponents and participants to partner with funds and actors that provide scaling support, maybe not even the traditional actors, and that the fund should increase the awareness of its implementing entities of potential scaling pathways and types of scaling. because there is a lot of opportunity. And you can find out more about our evaluations here. I think I have just made my time. Thank you very much. Over to you, Neha.
Thank you, Susan, and thank you so much for sticking to the time, but sharing quite a rich set of findings and the assessment that you did on a small part of the portfolio, but nonetheless giving really rich lessons. And your emphasis on the innovation, the pathway from piloting to scale, the importance of partnerships, and even in that last bit, what you said about raising the awareness of IEs, I think built into that was raising the capacity of the players, all the different partners involved to support scaling. So thank you so much, Susan, for that presentation. And Susan already went into a few of the examples from our portfolio, but we really wanted to hear from our implementing partners, from the countries, to see what scaling looked like in the projects and what factors led to the scaling or are leading to the scaling. So with that, I'm going to invite Natasha from UNDP. Natasha, I don't see you yet on my screen. There you are. Great. So Natasha, it's a big question and we've only given you 5 minutes. So this is really a challenge for you. But can you describe a little bit the project? We had the pleasure and the privilege of visiting it earlier this year. So when you speak, I know I'll have images in front of my eyes, but for the rest of us, can you describe the project? Is it being scaled? What is it that's leading to the scaling? What were some of the factors there for that success? Over to you, Natasha.
Thank you so much, Neha. Great to see you. I hope you hear me well.
Yes.
And thank you for inviting me. It's really a pleasure. So my remarks were based on the results of the regional transboundary project in Western Balkans, supported by the Adaptation Fund starting from 2019 until this year. And the project helped riparian countries of Albania, Montenegro, North Macedonia to address flood risks across the shared river basin of River Drin through integrated climate resilient flood risk management approaches. This involved enhanced data, hydrometeorological information services, transboundary policy institutional frameworks, and structural and non-structural flood protection measures. So scaling up in our case has been happening at different levels. First, replication of climate resilient flood risk management approaches and partnerships. Integration of the flood risk management strategy and plan developed by the Adaptation Fund project into the broader Drin River Strategic Action Program, which has been owned and shared by the countries, allowed replication of the Adaptation Fund measures through the follow-up future investments into Strategic Action Plan implementation. And that has been indeed happening already. Some of the successful Adaptation Fund solutions and activities are being now financed and implemented in the Kosovo share of the basin, which was outside of the Adaptation Fund project, through a follow-up GEF-funded International Waters project. Similarly, investments into shared climate and hydromet information, modeling systems, data sharing protocols also build the ground for further joint work in the basin. Second, I wanted to highlight scaling up flood protection adaptation investments and finance. Adaptation Fund project implemented a number of very specific community-based risk reduction measures in high-risk flood risk areas. However, in addition, and maybe even more importantly, the cost-benefit analysis and appraisal-based design of flood protection measures for much broader area of the basin has been also carried out by the Adaptation Fund project. And engineering support has been provided to the municipalities and local communities to design new interventions based on building on the lack of adequate engineering expertise at the local level. We help to prepare investment pipelines, sequence the investments, and develop a phased approach to negotiate with future funding partners. The project, Adaptation Fund project, also demonstrated successful technical solutions and nature-based solutions for replication. And finally, and importantly, we brought local municipal flood protection investment plans to the radars of the national governments and donors. And this is really a unique feature and service of the Adaptation Fund, based on the Adaptation Fund's focus on local community-based interventions and locally led adaptation. Through these projects, we can really empower local communities or municipalities and bring them to negotiation table at the national level with donors. Just to demonstrate you as a result, for example, the government of Montenegro already started financing and investing in some of these additionally designed flood protection measures, and applied to the European Union for additional 8 million euros investment to complete the flood risk management measures along 15 kilometers of the transboundary river in the basin, designed by the Adaptation Fund project. And UNDP has been facilitating negotiations with the European Commission and supported all the engineering and technical inputs during this phase. So I would like to highlight 5 key factors contributing to the successful scaling up in case of our project in Western Balkans. First, laying the ground for replication and scaling up with a solid policy and institutional foundation and empowering local players. For our project, we were really lucky and able to build on the existing solid institutional framework with strong national ownership and clear mandates supported earlier by the GEF Global Environmental Facility project. So we already worked in the context of Ministerial Memorandum of Understanding, the Green Core Steering Group, the Technical Working Group, Strategic Action Program for coordinated resource management. That was extremely helpful to then build up future adaptation interventions. The policy framework developed by the Adaptation Project Flood Risk Management Strategy and Action Plan included extensive consultations with stakeholders at local, national, regional level, alignment with the EU Flood Directive and the national EU accession plans, which is really the key development roadmap for all these countries, and included future priorities and catalogue of measures. Second, preparing financial plans and investment pipelines for future investments in the course of the project implementation. Third, aligning project finance with other vertical climate funds and development partners and moving from projects to portfolio approaches. So we actually had very successful example of alignment between the GEF International Waters portfolio and the Adaptation Fund investment, and we are looking at new opportunities to scale this portfolio. 4, demonstrating innovative solutions and de-risking of such solutions to support uptake of innovations. We demonstrated through this Adaptation Fund project proof of concept for nature-based flood risk reduction solutions combined with structural measures. Flood modeling data made available by this project might help in future design risk financing and insurance schemes, and ICT data centers increase capacities of the Hydromet Institute to develop new climate information services. And the last and final, providing information, technical, capacity building support to local partners during the phasing out or exit phase. As part of this systematic handover just referred to by Dr. Campbell today. That's all from me. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Natasha. And a lot of what you described is building on the points shared by, as you said, Dr. Kemper and Susan. So, this idea of the intervention being part of a broader institutional plan. You spoke about multiple agencies and stakeholders being involved from the start to a continuing engagement. You mentioned the involvement of community, which was critical for that ownership piece. You also mentioned that there are multiple donors. It's not just one type of scale up, but there's there were elements of that transaction and transformation scaling in what you shared. So thank you so much. Really helpful to get an idea of what's leading to the success in the Balkans. So with that, I'm going to move to Diana Oshana. Thank you so much for being with us. I don't see you yet, but I see that you've unmuted. If you can also switch on your video, if it's possible, that'll be fantastic.
Yes, thank you very much. I'm on field. I'm using someone's office, so that's one I didn't want to put on my camera. Bear with me with that. You're right. Thank you.
No problem, Diana. Diana, if you can tell us a little bit about the community-based adaptation project in Rwanda, how it's strengthening the resilience of communities, and what scale looks like in that context, and how scale can be achieved. So, Diana, over to you.
Thank you very much. For one, let me speak about the scale up project in Rwanda. So first of all, we had another project called Reducing Vulnerability to Climate Change in Northwest, part of community-based adaptation project. So the objective of the project was to strengthen a resilience of vulnerable communities in West Rwanda against climate change impact by implementing community-based adaptation strategies. So some of the key components of that project was climate smart agriculture, where we promoted resilient crops, sustainable farming practices, efficient water management, We did do also natural resources management, where we did reforestation, soil, watershed conservation to enhance ecosystem resilience. Also, we focused on community capacity building, where we give a mass of trainings and awareness programs to empower local communities in adopting adaptive practices. The project was expecting some of the big outcomes, which was aligned with our national transforming strategy, where we focused on enhancing food security and sustainable livelihoods. We also improved ecosystem resilience and reduced environmental degradation. So what I can say in Rwanda, when we say scalability of adaptation, it doesn't only mean expanding or mainstreaming resilience practices. We also tried, as others said, as Miko said, scaling up. It's also in our DNA. We try to scaling up all the ecosystem-based adaptation, which we piloted in those 2 districts in North to other districts. And we also institutionalize integration from the lesson learned from the other adaptation project, which ended up. And we tried to incorporate and involve the private sector, the cooperative and local enterprises in adaptation scheme. Another thing we did as the Ministry of Environment, we try to integrate adaptation interventions in our national policies and planning tools like NDCs, our district development strategies. And we also leverage partnership with development partners, other development partners, and also the private sector and the civil society was a good partner to mobilize co-financing and bring on board technical expertise, which supported really the replication and the scaling up of the projects that we had with adaptation funds. Thank you very much. I think I tried to summarize what we did on the pathways. How we did it. We had some direct pathways. When you look at the geographical expansion, so we extended the pilots activities that we did in those two districts in the north parts, like watershed management was expanded in other projects we had with green climate finance. And the project that we scaled up from the RVC3 CBA, from the Adaptation Fund, we have already submitted it to the Green Climate Fund, and it's on the, I may say it's on the last stage because the concept note was already approved. So the full project proposal was also submitted, and we had the first comments from the Adaptation Fund, and we continue to work on it until we get that project. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Anna. Thank you. And again, like a lot of things that you said are resonating with the speakers before you, and you mentioned a lot of different players involved in supporting those scaling efforts. You also mentioned private sector, and I was quite intrigued on what the private sector's role was. But before we go back to you and ask that question, there are a few questions in the chat, and I wanted to give the speakers a chance to respond. I might consolidate them into one question and ask Dr. Kemper and Susan, if you don't mind coming back on our screen and taking a stab at these questions. They're quite big ones, but just combining some of the things that are coming in the chat. There are questions about the relevance of context in determining these pathways. What are these scaling pathways? And what does it mean if there's direct budget support instead of some of the examples that we're hearing, for example, of other players come in? Could you share your reflections on these three areas? I know they're big areas, so you can pick and choose, but maybe starting with you, Dr. Kemper, and then I'll go to Susan.
Yes, thank you, Neha, and thank you for the really interesting questions. On the first question about the context, I think that would be really good for the Adaptation Fund itself to answer. From what I have seen in all the reports, context is incredibly important to the Adaptation Fund. But I leave that to you. I'd like to speak about the pathways and how it links to the transactional and transformational. The key issue here is that if if a country has a vision of where it wants to be, say it says we want to have all of the country adapted to climate change in all of the important areas, say, to start with, the most vulnerable ones. What is the pathway to get there? And one part of it may be transactional, more projects, and others may be more on the systemic side. And I think that Diane just gave a great example from Rwanda of what you are doing there, because if I understand you correctly, Diane, basically that is what you have. You want to adapt, especially in vulnerable parts of Rwanda, and you are bringing in multiple actors, multiple instruments, various ways of doing that. So you have a pathway towards that, and you're also making it transformational by bringing it into your national strategies. So that's how I would define a pathway. The key is to have a pathway and not to go randomly sometimes here, sometimes there, and maybe financing some project because maybe money was available. So that's on the pathway side. It's laid out more clearly in the study itself. And then the second question was that I'd like to speak to is on the parallel processes. I think that's very important because it has come up sometimes in the discussion of the study. There are very good examples where countries have said, okay, we want to work with multiple organizations, but we have a goal. So if we are working with multiple funders, each one of the funders should work with us towards this goal. And it doesn't need to be co-financed, one big document, and then one funder has cycle X and the other funder has cycle Y, and then it takes a very long time and it's very complicated. The country can say, we want to go in parallel. We want you all to contribute to our goal, and we want to create synergies, and we don't want to have overlapping financing that doesn't talk to each other. And in that sense, it can be very transformational, and it can be a great way of scaling. So I think that there is in the development community that there would be a lot to do in achieving more such examples. With that, back to Neha.
Thank you. Thanks so much, Sharon. Susan, did you want to share some thoughts?
Yeah, I'd love to speak to that comment on country context, because I think it's absolutely critical. And I think we've seen that in terms of the TURG, not just in the analysis of the portfolio, but also in our ex post evaluations, where we go back 3 to 5 years after project closure to see what stays in place. And what we have seen is, you know, if you want to scale, the mechanisms are so context sensitive. I can't give country specifics because we haven't presented all of our findings to the board, but I can say there are 2 recent countries, one where there was a very high degree of government involvement, even at the local level, that helped to scale things. And then in another country where the government was a much sort of a not really highly present, there were women's collectives that were actually extremely powerful in sort of scaling things that had been piloted. So I would completely agree. Also on communication, I think that's another important point. There are different ways in different countries of communicating and undertaking those knowledge activities. And what we found even is that there are within countries differences between how women and men are getting their information. So gender is another really important sort of part of that context puzzle. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Susan. Natasha, any thoughts from you? And then I'll give the last word to Diana before we start wrapping up.
Yeah, just very briefly, because my colleagues already mentioned a lot. I would probably highlight the need for the countries to build up nationally appropriate coordination, interagency coordination mechanisms in order to bring really the objectives outlined in the national adaptation plans towards the climate investment programs, strategies, and pipelines, and then resulting in climate investment portfolios. Going away from the really project-based financing and project-based negotiations with the donors. So if this national adaptation plans are linked directly to climate portfolios and funding partners, vertical funds are really drawn by the countries to support those strategic portfolios responding to the objective of the national adaptation plans, then I think this system level scaling up potential could be realized. Thanks a lot.
And as we know, a lot of countries are using this concept of country platforms to do that. They're bringing multiple players through a common vision and being able to look at that spectrum of transactional and transformational scaling. Countries are also looking to strengthen their NAPs. Many countries don't have NAPs at the moment, but strengthen their NDCs and NAPs because that also sets out the vision. So thank you so much for those thoughts. Diana, there's a new question in the chat, and I'm wondering if you'd help us tackle that one, because it's about improving localization and supporting evidence-driven reporting from local organizations. How can local organizations get access to funding? Diana, do you have any thoughts you'd like to share with us on that? I hope you haven't dropped. We knew that she was joining from the field, so we were really grateful that she's here, but it may have been that her connection is lost. So with that, we are going to have to wrap up. Thank you so much for the high engagement. A few things from my side before I hand to my colleague Martina for the closing remarks, and to share some of the next steps that we have taking all of this work forward. Diana, I see a chat from you saying, do you hear me? We do not hear you, unfortunately. If you're maybe give one last attempt. We're not able to hear you. If you have access to the chat, maybe you can share a few of your thoughts in the chat function, because we are heading towards the close of this hour. But I did want to say that context, as others have said, is very, very important to the Adaptation Fund. Scaling has to be contextual. What means scaled in one context may not be scaled in another context. We don't require co-financing. We fund the full cost of adaptation, and scaling is not a criteria for selection, but something that we're supporting through the project cycle. And we don't think everything should be scaled. Like you heard from a lot of the speakers today, our model is to pilot and then see what needs to be scaled and then support that process. So with that, I'm going to hand to Martina to bring this hour to a close and share some next steps from the Adaptation Fund Secretariat side. Martina, go ahead.
Thank you, Neha, and thank you to all the speakers and participants for a rich and thought-provoking session. Over the past hour, we have deepened the understanding on what scalability means in the context of climate adaptation. We have heard from case study, evaluation, about opportunities, but also challenges the fund faces in driving scale. But we also heard inspiring country examples that showed scaling in action, from building pilot initiatives that can influence national but also regional systems and policies. So a few messages stood out. Scaling doesn't happen by accident. It requires intentional planning right from project design with concrete scaling targets. Evidence and learning are essential to understanding what works and what doesn't work, and how to adapt approaches across different sectors and contexts. Partnerships and alignment with national priorities, but also local needs and vertical climate funds are critical drivers of sustainable and systemic scaling. And scaling is not just about traditional initiatives. that are nearly completion and have already demonstrated strong results. It is also about creating pathways for promising pilots that can introduce innovative solutions so they can be tested, adapted, but also expanded to achieve wider impacts. So what are now the next steps for the Secretariat? The Secretariat will continue to integrate these insights into programming and also support to implementing entities, but also executing entities. We will strengthen how we plan for scaling at the project design stage, enhance the tracking of scaling outcomes through our monitoring, evaluation, and learning systems, and also expand knowledge sharing across the portfolio. We are going to build on the study's recommendations, and the Adaptation Fund will also develop its own scale-up framework. In parallel, as it was mentioned before, we are also designing an improved structured approach to support the scaling up of completed or advanced Adaptation Fund funded projects with GCF financing. But the lessons from this webinar, the case study, the evaluation, and the country examples will also inform the phase of the next medium-term strategy, the medium-term strategy number 3, ensuring that scaling remains central to the fund's DNA, as it was mentioned before. Finally, through today's discussion, we encourage all partners, implementing entities, executing entities, but also the broader stakeholders to engage with us in further dialogue on scaling and share also your experiences and evidence. So thank you once again all for your active participation, and we really look forward to continuing this journey together, from piloting successful innovation to achieving broader adaptation at scale. Thank you.
Thank you all. Thanks for joining.
Thank you.